It was like right out of a bad horror movie. Officers moved into the seemingly vacant mansion on Hillside Avenue, expecting to find a family gone on vacation. What they found shocked them. On some of the walls, what looked like blood stains appeared, and what they saw in the ballroom chilled even the most hardened detective. Bodies, 4 of them, were positioned in almost a ritualistic manner after being shot. Few lights remained on in the house, and the ones that were fast burning out. The mother and children were dead, and police discovered one more body in the attic. This was an older woman. Eerie organ music continued to play throughout the house. Bloodstains were in the kitchen and on the walls. The Westfield drama coach identified the bodies as one of his students, Patricia List, 16, and her family. John List, the patriarch of the List household, was nowhere to be found. He immediately became a suspect in the murder of his family. A note to his pastor would confirm his involvement in their slaughter. But the question is why? Why would a family man who seemed to be on the fast track to career success murder his family in cold blood? Perhaps there were other, more subtle reasons. John List was born in Bay City, Michigan on September 17, 1925, to John Frederick and Alma List. From the beginning, John List would be raised with the strict ideals and rules of the Lutheran religion, Missouri Synod. His mother Alma doted on him. Some would say Alma was too overprotective. Her own church pastor would later comment she was being excessive, but John never rebelled. On the contrary, John would grow up to uphold the very values he was brought up with and try to instill them in his own children. John would witness once in his childhood a meeting going on that may have had a pivotal influence on his actions decades later. A woman was at this meeting, and John knew a serious matter was being discussed at hand. Voices were heard when the woman would exit crying. It would turn out the matter being discussed was that of divorce. In the Lutheran religion, divorce was a serious transgression. Till death do us part was meant to be taken literally. This woman wanted to divorce her husband, which resulted in her excommunication. John enlisted and served his country overseas before coming home to enlist at the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor. At Alma's urging, List enrolled in the accounting program and graduated in 1950. It was the year after, 1951, that fate would set off an unstoppable chain of events leading up to the murders. This first meeting between murderer and victim would take place in a bowling alley in Virginia, where John was stationed after graduation near Fort Eustis. John List and a military friend wanted to kill some time and possibly go looking for eligible women. More so John's friend. John's friend insisted they go out, and they set out for a night of bowling. Back at home in Virginia, Helen Morris Taylor was still getting over a loss. Her first husband, Marvin Taylor, had been killed in action in Korea just months before. Helen had a 9-year-old daughter from that marriage. The loss ate at her. Helen's sister, Jean Seifert, suggested a night out to take Helen's mind off the recent loss. They too were to go bowling. At first, John's friend made moves, but he was married. John List didn't think much of this. After a few days, John knocked on Helen's door, apparently to apologize for his friend. Helen and John ended up courting and were married less than 6 months later, on December 1st, 1951. They celebrated at a smart supper club. It's ironic the writing on between the lines wasn't seen when John went to apologize to Helen. John saw fault in what his friend was doing. Adultery was wrong in the Lutheran religion, but years later John would end up committing the ultimate transgression in his faith: murder. Murder to save their souls from sin of poverty and destitution, or so in his mind. Helen and John were married in 1951. They drank and danced at a smart supper club with the Seiferts on Seifert's bill. The newlyweds were still somewhat shy with each other. This puzzled John's new brother-in-law, Gene Seifert, but nonetheless they seemed happy. Helen insisted they marry in Maryland. John didn't know this at the time, but Maryland was a state that did not require a blood test before marriage. Helen had contracted syphilis from her first husband, Marvin Taylor. There were other problems. John, always the devout Christian, found a Lutheran church wherever employment took him. A few times, Helen would turn irate and would tell John she wasn't interested in becoming a member. She would insist John tell his pastor to take her name off the church community membership rolls. Their first child, Patricia Marie, would arrive in January of 1955, followed by a son, John Frederick, in 1956, and another son, Frederick Michael, in 1958. Often John would be sitting in the pews with 3 toddlers in tow, without Helen. Helen went a few times, but it was mostly John who was the parent in attendance as the children grew. Neighbors recall lights on at the List House and a figure vacuuming on Friday nights at 3 in the morning. Helen's health was deteriorating, rendering her unable to do most household chores and incapable of gainful employment. This was coupled by the belief that John had that the man and the man only had a civic responsibility to provide for his family. This belief was carried over from his stern, industrious father. Helen would be known to call John at work, requesting John to come home and change the toddler's diapers. John, his face blotchy with anger and then embarrassment, would oblige. List kept losing jobs. In 1965, the family moved to Westfield, New Jersey for a new start. Alma List signed over power of attorney on her estate to her son on one condition: that she move there with them. To say the couple had a tendency to overspend would be an understatement. Alma List partly financed the home John and Helen had set their sights on in Westfield. Alma would live in the upstairs attic apartment. She would later write to friends the last years of her life were her unhappiest. Alma and Helen did not get along. The 60s and the counterculture undercurrent swept over Westfield just like anywhere else. Patty, List's daughter, was coming of age in that time. John List hated everything the 60s represented. John List was a part of the silent generation of the 1940s and 50s, which should have been his time. List's generation had lived through a depression and a world war. With the exception of Korea, times were relatively prosperous and peaceful after World War II then, so why rock the boat? The children of that generation, coming of age in the late 60s and early 1970s, needed something to rebel against, and that provided the perfect backdrop. The sexual revolution, in part, was the stepping stone of this phenomenon. People in the silent generation, of course, could not understand this. Times seemed to be good, so why rock the boat? Perhaps also it was the birth of the teenager and America's involvement in Vietnam springing this recognition and rebellion. Teenagers coming of age during that time found a new niche for themselves. When they were coming of age, civil unrest was starting to sweep America and the world. John List's children were growing up in the thick of it all. Patty stopped receiving communion, which crushed her father. He tried to shield his family from the evils of the world by immersing himself and his children in the doctrine and spirit and social community of the Lutheran Church. But with Patty beginning to rebel and with Helen not attending church, he was fighting an uphill battle. There were rumors Patty had been smoking marijuana and dabbling in Wicca, two cardinal sins, in quotes, to staid Lutherans. Johnny and Freddie still drew most of their friends from the congregation, but List felt time was running out. Helen was getting worse, staying in bed for most of the day, almost every day actually. His daughter was becoming wayward and involved in theater, another sin in John List's religious mind. And he kept losing jobs. Something about John's demeanor told his superiors John couldn't make it as upper-level management. List would waddle back and forth at business meetings. After one firing, List would leave the house each morning and sit in the train station all day reading, his family thinking he was going to work. List tried praying for answers and guidance. Apparently none never came. Facing destitution, List came up with a plan. Murder. In later years after his capture, List would claim it was the only way. List wanted them to enter the kingdom of heaven while still Christians, but one has to question, if there is such a place, if List himself would be allowed entry after wiping out his entire family only to save their souls. Would his be saved? One night at dinner, a few nights before the massacre, List bluntly asked his 3 children, "Would you prefer to be buried or cremated?" List then left the room to sulk. List had originally planned the massacre for All Saints' Day, November 1st, but travel plans had been delayed, so the massacre took place 8 days later. Patty had sent ominous warnings to her drama coach like, "If we go on vacation, don't believe we're on vacation." Her drama coach took this lightly, reasoning kids will be kids. November 9th, 1971 would go on to be List's day of infamy. Throughout the day, List would murder each member of his family, one by one. He would kill his mother and wife first, then the children as they came home from school. After the murders, List knelt down and prayed for each one, bidding their souls to depart in peace. List would sleep the night in the house before departing in the morning. As he departed, List put on eerie classical music that played on the intercom system throughout the house. He then drove away to a new life. List would leave his car abandoned at JFK Airport in Queens. John Emil List would then become Robert Peter Clark. List selected this new name carefully as he remembered a classmate at the University of Michigan with that name. When the bodies were discovered, police were at a loss. List had planned his massacre so thoroughly. At first it was assumed List would be among the attendees at the family funeral. Police were on watch at the funeral, but List did not arrive. Another avenue was taken to help try solve the case, the use of a psychic. This psychic mentioned a connection with Baltimore, Maryland. List married Dolores, his second wife there. She also mentioned something about him fleeing to the southwest. He ultimately escaped to Colorado, it would be found out eventually. She also mentioned List had not traveled by plane, as presumed, but by bus or train, which proved to be correct. The mansion on Hillside Avenue became a haunt for local teenagers. Seances and a game called Going to the John were the favorite activities. The mansion mysteriously burnt down in August of 1972. It would take nearly 2 decades before List would be captured. List would be captured in Virginia and brought back to New Jersey to stand trial. When coming face to face with his sister-in-law and brother-in-law, they would ask, "Why, John?" "There was no other way," he would reply. Now, I'm going to cast the chart from the approximate time he fired his first shot and killed his wife Helen List, 46. And my source is the title "Thou Shalt Not Kill" by Mary S. Ryzuk, Warner Books Inc., New York, 1990, pages 262 and 263. And the chart is cast for, entitled simply, "The John List Massacre, November 9th, 1971, 8:40 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, Westfield, New Jersey." John List epitomized the generation of World War II in the 50s, materially acquisitive and timid in the face of authority. He should have lived out the American dream. Granted, he did for a while. But something went wrong for John List. He married his wife, not knowing she'd contracted syphilis from her first husband. They always lived way beyond their means and ran into frequent money troubles and arguments at home. John tried so hard to please his new bride, Helen, and give the air of a well-adjusted family man. But he kept losing jobs and having to move his family around every few years. He sought refuge in his church and prayed for help. Apparently, his prayers went unanswered. Then his daughter began to rebel, and his wife Helen turned away from his religion. John List killed off his family one by one on a cold November day in 1971. Mars is the domain of assertiveness and sometimes violent action. Mars rules weapons, such as guns and knives, in the army. List used his gun from his old army days in Germany. Here, we find Mars, violence and aggression, in the third house of communication and everyday errands, in the sign representing Jesus, the sign of Pisces. List was a religious man who took his Christianity very seriously. At the time his first shot was fired, Mars in Pisces was in the third house. Mars rules again violence, guns, and aggression. Pisces is associated with the fish, or Jesus, the sign of the fish, and the third house again represents communication and the lower mind. Errands. List meticulously shot his family one by one, in between running errands around town and writing letters to school authorities. In his letter to his pastor, third house communication letter writing, List goes on about saving his children from a life of degeneration. He claimed if his family were to turn destitute and no longer be Christians, then what could be gained? His mother also got involved, so you could say this crime was executed, at least partly in the name of religion, of saving their souls. In the next house, Chiron is at 10 degrees Aries. Chiron in astrology is the wounded healer. It emphasizes what the native must work toward and conquer in his or her own healing journey. I mentioned the degree because that in itself is significant, as we shall see later. Aries, once again, is ruled by Mars and occupies the fourth house. It's curious to mention here that as the day went on, his third house of communication errands and fourth houses, home and relatives, were all occupied by Martian energy, especially the middle of the day, when his massacre reached its climax. As the day went on, Aries, ruled by Mars, moved into the third house of errands, as he killed his family one by one and did his deadly errands around Westfield. Now back to Chiron, the wounded healer in Aries. All List's life he was the opposite of bold and courageous. He'd waddle back and forth during business meetings. Both his mother and to some degree his wife dominated him. When his wife was too sick to do the household chores, he'd end up doing them himself, on top of cooking dinner for the family and holding down a job. When he lost his job once, he'd sit and read in the train station in Westfield and come home at night, afraid to tell his wife he'd lost another job. He always seemed doomed to failure because he just couldn't hack it with his meek and mild personality. In some perverse way, I believe with the first shot to his wife's head that day, he started to work toward his own healing journey. After all those years as a wounded corporate drone, with that first gunshot, I believe in his mind he was on his way to being at least partly healed, albeit at the sad expense of others who paid with their own lives. Earlier I mentioned the critical degree 10 Aries. There is a special significance to this because 10 Aries is the degree of spiritual triumph. List was a devoutly religious man in the Lutheran religion. The strange thing is, though, Chiron was retrograde, moving backwards at the time of the massacre. Chiron is also in the 4th house of family ties and home roots. In his mind, he was killing his family to save their souls. But here, in retrograde, Chiron suggests otherwise. With that first gunshot, I believe he was stepping into actual spiritual disintegration in his home that day. He may have karmically, spiritually saved their souls, but karmically and spiritually, he may have signed his own death warrant. I strongly believe he will pay for this transgression in the next existence. He may have thought he sent their souls to heaven, and he may have, but Chiron retrograde, opposite of spiritual triumph, suggests he signed his own spiritual death warrant that day. At the time of the massacre, the sun was in Scorpio, sign of covering tracks and mystery. He selected a time of year when secretive Scorpio made for him a clean getaway. He meticulously covered up his tracks, calling the schools, the milkman, and others so nobody would arouse suspicion. At the same time, he sure made an extravagant getaway just the same. Moon and Leo in the house of death. He covered up his tracks, then to top it all off, he left classical music on. Leo is the showman of the zodiac. When the crimes were discovered, the funeral drew hundreds of mourners, mostly kids, and backed out onto the streets. It was a media and emotional spectacle. All this again mirroring or squaring his Scorpio perfect getaway. On another note, the 11th house illustrates one's hopes and aspirations. I believe he aspired to meticulously plan this crime and execute it, then make a perfect getaway. This was in his mind for months. Then the death chamber was a media circus, Leo again, the town of Westfield hasn't seen before or since. Hence he became what was called the boogeyman of Westfield. One last note on his 3rd house of communicating. He did write his pastor a letter stating his plans in a confession as to why he committed the murders. Mars, violence in Pisces, Jesus, religion, justification, in the 3rd house letter writing. The pastor who received it was a Christian minister. John List claimed he was doing his family a service by shutting out their lives. Gemini is the sign of communication. With Saturn, planet of restrictions and limitations in that sign, and with Mars and Pisces in the 3rd house, apparently he even acted shy toward his family as he shot each of them to death. Few words were said, Saturn and Gemini, as he did his family members a service in the 6th house and shot them to death to save their souls, or so to speak. Often different aspects of a chart interwove together to make a whole, such as the case here. All this was squaring the violent tendency in which he killed them, for which religion was one of the reasons. He was still shy, yet he did the task violently and claimed they'd get to heaven. I actually believe he really meekly believed there was no other way. I actually believe he thought he'd sent their souls to his version of an afterlife. Afterwards, he even knelt down and prayed for each of their souls. Then he asked for forgiveness. I don't know why, but I happen to believe he was sincere in this respect. The rising sign for this event is in Sagittarius, sign of long journeys and travel. What people saw was not only a clean getaway, but List traveled to the opposite end of the country and roamed from trailer park to apartment to apartment. He'd walk the streets of Denver to explore his new surroundings. This event ascended as opposite Saturn and Gemini again, so while he was traveling, he still maintained his inward, shy, retiring exterior. He just changed his name and grew a mustache. This event eventually led him to even change his occupation and career for a short time. He tried out the restaurant business and became a chef for a while. Uranus and Pluto both in Libra, a career transformation, balancing of the scales, and food for that matter, in the 10th house of career and public standing suggests this. After Liszt went underground, his career and public standing definitely changed, as did his living arrangements. Gone was the title of vice president and comptroller to another one, chef. He was now living as an anonymous fugitive and not as a family man. Pluto also occupies his 10th house. I believe upon arriving in Denver, Liszt went through a sort of metamorphosis and transformation himself. This transformation ultimately led him back into accounting and back east, where he was ultimately arrested in 1989. He traveled once more, Sagittarius rising again, this time to Virginia, and then back to New Jersey to serve his prison sentence.